Aloha, everyone. Hope you're having a glorious day. We are studying the book of James. This book of James is very difficult to hear. Nearly half of the verses are imperatives. Now, it's easy as a Christian to hear in the Bible what God has done or what He promises to do, the indicatives. But when we as Christians are called out by James here to get off the bench, to get involved and do something, well, now it becomes personal. Western reformers have been accused of ignoring these imperatives toward the poor in a setting of industrialization, urbanization, and consumer capitalism. Here in chapter 1, verse 27, we see pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their adversity and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Good words by James. Difficult words that were challenging the Western reformers during the time that people were marginalized in the growth of industrialization, urbanization, consumer capitalism. Prosperity gospel proponents have used James here in chapter 4, verse 2 to support name it and claim it. You do not have because you do not ask. Now, if you're going to find out what it is to live as a Christian, who better to ask than someone who grew up with Jesus? And James and all these imperatives are a how-to in daily living out the believer's life. Did you know that Alcoholics Anonymous was once considered to be named the James Club because it relies on the wisdom of James to submit to God to overcome our sinful, fleshly behaviors? Who is James? James is the brother of Jesus. Read here in Mark 6:3. Isn't this Jesus the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James? This James is different, remember, than the two apostles named James. There was James of Zebedee, and there was James and Judas of Alphaeus. So this James is different than the two disciples named James. Now remember, Jesus' family at one point thought that Jesus was mad. Read here in Mark 3:21. When his family heard this, they went out to restrain him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." James might have been in the company of his family, Jesus' family, thinking that his brother has lost his mind. Not even his brothers believed in him as Messiah. Read here in John 7:5, for not even his own brothers believed in him. How does James go from not believing his brother is the Messiah to being a pillar of the church? Look what Paul says about James. Read with me in Galatians 2:9-10. James, Peter, and John, who had a reputation as pillars of the church, recognized the grace that had been given to me. They gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we would go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. They requested only that we remember the poor, the very thing I was also eager to do. So here we know James went from unbeliever to a faith so filled up to overflowing that James requested Paul to remember the poor. Remember, this is Paul the evangelist to the Gentiles, who takes up an offering of the churches and brings it to the church in Jerusalem. This James, the brother of Jesus, is telling Paul, remember the poor. James goes from unbeliever to pillar of the church after the resurrected Jesus appeared to James. 1 Corinthians 15:7. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. James encountered the risen Jesus and was ready to present himself as a living sacrifice after doing that. See how it all starts. See, Jesus is crucified, and Mary and her sons are hanging out in Jerusalem with the disciples. Read with me in Acts 1. All these continued together in prayer with one mind, together with the women, along with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. Now, Peter sends news to the disciples, but names James as needing to be a recipient of the news. Look here in Acts 12:17. Peter mentioned to them with his hands to be quiet, and then he related how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. Peter said, "Tell James and the brothers these things." And then Peter left and went to another place. Now, James preaches to the Jews in Jerusalem, overseeing the church for 30 years, speaking with authority as a leader. Look here on an internal debate of the Gentile believers. Read with me in Acts 15. After they stopped speaking, James replied, "Brothers, listen to me. Simeon has explained how God first concerned himself to select from among the Gentiles a people for his name. Therefore, I conclude that we should not cause extra difficulty for those among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we should write them a letter telling them to abstain from things defiled by idols and from sexual immorality and from what has been strangled and from blood." So here is amazing spirit-led discernment of James for the Gentile believers trying to follow along beside the Jews. You know, the Jews with all their customs and rituals that point to Jesus as Christ, the Messiah. But James tells them, hey, don't feel any obligation to follow those things they're going to try to put on you. Just don't eat food sacrificed to idols. Eat foods prepared kosher. This will change the habits of Gentile believers. Think about it. Much of your week is spent procuring and preparing food. Now, if I specified the food you should eat, it will change who you interact with. It will change who you buy the food with, who you spend time with. If you go to the Jewish markets, well, guess what? You're going to be talking kosher. You're going to be talking about blood sacrifice and why the Jews procure their food in the way that they do. And then you get to talk about Jesus as Messiah, the one that has fulfilled the law. Now, secondly, James says, abstain from sexual immorality. Well, this one's obvious. This will keep them from going to places of defilement, like the pagan temple prostitutes. And James' advice here is a practical approach at keeping Gentile Christians in fellowship with their brothers and sisters regularly. They won't be preoccupied with things like sex and temple prostitutes. His guidelines are as free as could allow for these Christians to go in every other aspect of their lives to share the gospel. Now, Paul, the evangelist to the Gentiles, met up with James on at least 2 occasions that we know. And on one, he was bringing famine relief from collections of the church outside Judea. Galatians 1, then after 3 years, Paul went up to Jerusalem to visit Peter and get information from him. And I stayed with him for 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In Acts 21, the next day, Paul went in with us to see James, and all the elders were there. James, the brother of Jesus, gives us an amazing example of faith in the resurrected Jesus. Despite intense persecution, James never left Jerusalem. And we know that because of his boldness of faith, he became a constant thorn in the side to the Pharisees and Sadducees who found any preaching or teaching about Jesus to be totally aberrant to them. The historian Josephus tells us that a new high priest by the name of Ananus saw an opportunity to make a name for himself. And there was a change in the Roman procurator. And while the new procurator, Albinus, was on the way, Ananus saw the opportunity to get rid of James. He saw it as a window of opportunity to accuse and put James to death without the trial that he knew the new procurator would have demanded under Roman law. Although Ananus did get his way, it backfired heavily on him, as when Albinus finally arrived, he had Ananus dismissed from his high position of high priest as soon as he heard what had happened. Now, Eusebius, a 4th century church historian, adds details of the death of James. He states that the scribes and Pharisees took James to a public place, the top of a wing of the temple, and demanded that he should renounce the faith of Christ before all the people. But rather than deny Jesus, James declared himself fully before the whole multitude and confessed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, our Savior and Lord. Hegesippus tells us that at this point, they went up and threw down the just man from the temple height and said to each other, "Let's stone James the just." And they began to stone him, for he was not killed by the fall, but he knelt down and said, "I entreat thee, Lord God our Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Thus James followed his brother's example to the last. One of them, who was a fuller, took the club with which he beat out clothes and struck the just man on the head. And thus James suffered martyrdom. Josephus records in Antiquities of the Jews 20:200, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, is killed by the Jewish religious hierarchy by stoning. And this was in 62 AD. James really comes alive with a recent archaeological discovery. Oded Golan, who first acquired this limestone bone box or ossuary that showed the Aramaic phrase James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. This finding was announced to the public in 2002. An ossuary is a container that is used for human bones after burial. It can be an urn, a box, or a vault. Now, during this historic period of the Second Temple, from probably 2nd century BC until the fall of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD, burial custom in Israel called for internment of human remains in cave-like rooms to decompose. And after at least a year, the bones were then placed in a box, like ossuaries, which were commonly made of limestone. Now, this box came to be known as the James ossuary. And because the names corresponded to those of Jesus of Nazareth's brother, some people have claimed that the box once must have held the bones of the brother of Jesus. Now, when the James ossuary came to light, it was potentially of enormous significance. So in 2003, the charge that the inscription was a fake was lodged by the Israeli Antiquities authorities. Oded Golan faced 40 counts of forgery. According to biblical archaeology, no experts maintain the box is a fake. All acknowledge the box or ossuary is genuine and from the period when Jesus lived. The inscription is what is at issue. Now, even then, only the last part of it, brother of James, is in question. The government's criminal complaint itself recognizes that the first part of the inscription is authentic and charges only that the brother of Jesus has been recently forged. But after a grueling 7-year trial, a judge cleared Oded Golan, who owned the box, of the forgery charges. He was convicted of illegal trading in antiquities. But some critically thinking people have asked why Oded Golan's being cleared has received so little attention and what this says about the veracity of the inscription. Historian and author Pierluigi Tombetti wrote in Ancient Origins in June of 2019 that the original discovery of the ossuary caused such an uproar that ecclesiastical authorities and security services of some nations intervened and, finding nothing else to challenge, focused their accusations on the final part of this epigraph, brother of Jesus, which was thought to have been falsified and artificially aged with a chemical patina. Now, according to Tombetti and other supporters of Oded Golan, the fury over the James ossuary was fueled in part by a desire to deny that Mary, mother of Jesus, gave birth to other children, as well as the wish to suppress any archaeological evidence of the existence of Jesus. Tombetti wrote, while some scholars initially supported the prosecution's thesis, now all the scientists were in agreement. The patina deposited on the inscription had been found to be authentic by a chemical analysis. In addition, a microorganism was found on the inscription and on the ossuary, a fungus that takes at least 100 years to expand by a few inches. It covered a vast area of the ossuary, and in particular, its presence was detected over the entire inscription. This meant that its dating had to be forcibly backdated to many centuries ago, approximately to the 1st century AD, and the same applies to the entire epigraph. We began this book of James knowing the living sacrifice of its author. James lived out his life trying to make Jesus known to all the world.